Strange events have been reported across forests, mountains, and snow-covered trails, leaving behind terrifying clues no one can explain. From glowing lights over fjords to chilling growls in highland storms, each account points to something massive and intelligent lurking unseen. Survivors describe footprints larger than any human, camps torn apart, and patterns carved into nature itself. These encounters stretch from Canada to Siberia, yet all share the same haunting presence watching from the shadows. Stay with us till the end, because each story uncovers a piece of a mystery that refuses to stay hidden. On August 6th, 2025, the Cascade Mountains carried a stillness that felt heavier than usual, and David Mercer, a Navy veteran who had spent years sharpening his instincts under challenging conditions, felt that weight settled deep in his chest. He had chosen to hike the fog-drenched ridge alone, drawn by the quiet challenge of the wilderness. With a life shaped by service and survival training, he was no stranger to silence, yet the sudden absence of birdsong and wind sent a chill through him stronger than any mountain breeze. The mist thickened around him until the world seemed reduced to a gray wall, and every crunch of his boots sounded far too loud. His senses sharpened, and his mind told him something unseen was close, watching. Then it happened. The veil of fog shifted, and a massive figure emerged, towering higher than any man, its size almost blending with the trees. The ground seemed to thrum with its presence. David's body moved before thought, his rifle raised and firing two sharp bursts that cracked through the suffocating quiet. The shots echoed across the ridge, but instead of falling, the thing halted. For a frozen moment, it stared, and the silence broke with a roar that rattled the forest from root to canopy. The sound was not just loud, but deep, as though the earth itself groaned. Birds burst upward in a chaotic cloud, fleeing into the gray sky. David's breath came in bursts, and with a pounding heart, he dropped low, pressing against the rough bark of a fallen log for cover. When he forced himself to glance upward, the fog had reclaimed the space, swallowing the shape whole, yet the proof of its presence remained. On the ground, near the edges of his camp, were impressions so large that no man could have made them. Each step was nearly half a meter long, pressed deep into the soil, circling in careful paths rather than in random trails. It was as if the creature was measuring him, examining the camp, or perhaps marking something he could not understand. Branches lay scattered nearby, but not broken in wild force. Rather, they were bent and placed, forming rough shapes that looked like crude symbols carved from nature itself. Nothing about the arrangement felt accidental. It spoke of purpose, of intelligence. The forest around him seemed alive with that awareness, the mist turning from cover into a cage. Every snapped twig, every hollow echo in the distance felt aimed at him. His training urged him to hold steady, but instinct pulled harder, telling him that staying meant becoming prey. Clutching his rifle tight, with eyes darting to every shadow, he moved with uneven steps back toward the slope that led away from the ridge. The Cascade fog pressed close, swallowing light and shape. Yet within its cover, David felt no safety, only the unshakable sense that something vast and patient was still there, stalking just beyond what his eyes could reach, waiting for him to falter. David moved with careful steps, his breath sharp against the cold air, as the Cascade fog wrapped the ridge in thick silence. Every motion felt heavier, as if the mountain itself resisted him leaving. He had survived war zones and distant seas, yet nothing compared to the crushing awareness that something hidden and immense was tracking his path. The imprints circling the ground were burned into his mind, not as random signs, but as evidence of a presence that thought, planned, and waited. His training told him to study patterns, yet his heart urged retreat, pulling him toward lower ground where the mist seemed thinner. When he finally reached the edge of the slope, the forest showed more traces that deepened his unease. Trees bore marks higher than any human arm could reach, gouges cut with strength that bent the bark outward. Broken limbs formed sharp angles in the soil, arranged with unsettling order. It was not chaos, but a message carved into the landscape, one he could not read. The acrid scent in the air clung to his throat, a harsh reminder that whatever he had faced was not gone, but lingering close. The mountain felt alive, watching every step. His body trembled as he reached a stream and dipped his hands into the icy water, trying to ground himself. Ripples spread, yet no sound came from the forest. The quiet was worse than any storm. His eyes followed the shoreline, where fresh signs appeared once more. Deep tracks pressed into the mud, each longer than his arm from elbow to wrist. They moved in patterns, curving around rocks and circling the water, as though the unseen stalker studied more than just him. The precision of those paths filled him with dread. It was not hunger or accident, but deliberate observation. Hours later, he stumbled down the ridge toward a ranger station. Every branch creaked behind him, a shadow of pursuit. When he reached shelter, his hands shook as he pointed out the wounds in the earth and the broken branches. Yet disbelief followed him, officials suggesting common explanations: bears, tricks of fog, or fear twisting his mind. None of their words matched the towering figure, the roar that shook the sky, or the deliberate markings left behind. His story settled into silence, dismissed but not forgotten. Days turned into restless nights, where the veteran could not escape the echo of that moment. In dreams, the roar returned, shaking him awake with a pounding heart. Reports of strange marks on nearby trails surfaced, but no one linked them to his account. Locals whispered of strange shapes in the mist, of fires found scattered, of animals vanishing near the ridge. The weight of secrecy pressed against him, for he knew what he saw had not been chance. The cascade fog was more than weather. It was a shroud hiding something vast, patient, and intelligent. And though he had escaped that day, the memory of being measured by something beyond human still followed him like a shadow that refused to fade. On January 14th, 1998, the White Mountains were buried under heavy snow as Park Ranger Daniel Hawthorne began his early patrol along a remote trail. He was a man used to solitude, trained to read the forest and understand its silence. But that morning carried an unease he could not ignore. The storm swept through the ridges, cloaking everything in white haze, while the wind bit at his face. Daniel, a ranger with years of experience in the wilderness, was steady in his steps, but his mind sharpened when he caught strange tones carried on the storm. They were not the usual creaks of trees or calls of animals, but deep, uneven voices, layered and slow, drifting across the frozen pines. He paused, listening, the sound repeating in patterns like chanting from an unseen source. Expecting lost hikers, Daniel followed the echoes deeper into the trees. Each step forward seemed to pull him into something hidden, the storm muting the world around him. The noises grew clearer, vibrating through the cold air in a rhythm that no human tongue could shape. His training told him to remain cautious, but his instincts screamed that he had stumbled onto something unnatural. The white curtain of snow lifted just enough for him to see a shape on the ground ahead. It was Samuel Briggs, a hunter known in the area, lying motionless in the clearing. The shock of the sight froze him where he stood. Samuel was stripped bare, the body pale against the snow, arranged with care that seemed far from chance. Daniel's eyes rose, and he saw the missing clothes. They were not scattered, but carefully placed, hanging high in the branches above, almost like an offering. The arrangement was too precise for any accident. His chest tightened as he studied the snow beneath his boots. The ground was marked with impressions so large they seemed unreal, each nearly half a meter in length. They surrounded the scene, moving in deliberate circles, as if some immense being had paced around the lifeless hunter, watching. The ranger's gaze drifted to the trees. Saplings had been twisted until they snapped, their broken forms bent into shapes that made no sense yet carried the weight of intention. Branches pointed inward toward the body, lines converging like a sign he could not read. The chanting in the distance faded, leaving behind only the whistle of the storm. The silence pressed heavily on him, and he knew at once this was not the work of weather, nor of accident, nor of madness alone. When the authorities arrived, the scene was quickly marked down as the tragedy of exposure, a case of hypothermia that had driven a man to strip away his clothes in confusion. Yet Daniel felt the truth in his bones as he stood apart, eyes locked on the footprints that vanished into the forest. Something vast had been there, something that arranged, marked, and lingered. And as the snow thickened again, he felt sure it was still close, listening, waiting. The storm deepened as night closed over the mountains, and Daniel Hawthorne remained unsettled by what he had seen. The official report, written by others, claimed that Samuel Briggs had fallen to the cold. But the ranger could not forget the ordered branches, the vast impressions in the snow, and the strange way the body had been displayed. In his years of service, he had seen tragedies caused by weather, but this was different. It was marked by purpose. That knowledge weighed heavy, even as the forest returned to silence. The stillness was not peaceful but charged, as though something unseen lingered just beyond sight. The following days brought little relief. Snow covered the clearing, hiding the signs, but in Daniel's mind, the image remained sharp. The branches had not broken by chance, and the marks pressed into the ground had not been left by man. When he returned along the same patrol routes, the forest seemed too quiet, as if every bird and creature had fled from the higher ridges. He began to notice changes that others ignored. Small trees bent in uniform shapes, lines etched into the frost, and unnatural gaps where the snow seemed flattened into shallow circles. These patterns spread across remote paths, leading nowhere but leaving behind a sense of careful design. At night, the ranger's cabin was filled with a different kind of unease. The storm winds often carried faint vibrations that echoed against the walls. They were low and steady, reminding him of the sounds he had followed on the morning he discovered the body. He wondered if he had not interrupted something more than a natural death, something that had been performed with intent. He found himself waking before dawn, listening for tones that seemed to vanish when he tried to focus. The forest was not empty. It was alive with a presence that chose when to reveal itself. The authorities closed the case, but whispers began to spread among nearby hunters and trappers. They spoke of voices that rose and fell in the distance during heavy snow, of symbols carved into the bark of old pines, and of shapes moving between trees when the moonlight hit the ridges. Some claimed to see figures too large to be men standing motionless before slipping away into the shadows. Others avoided the mountains altogether, believing the wilderness held more than storms and predators. Daniel listened, but rarely spoke, carrying with him the burden of what he alone had witnessed closely. As weeks passed, snowfall covered the traces, yet the feeling of being observed did not fade. The ranger knew the mountains had always demanded respect, but this was different. The cold had hidden not only danger, but also awareness. Samuel Briggs had been found, but the questions left behind grew heavier with each patrol. Something vast and intelligent remained within those woods, shaping the silence into patterns, leaving marks only the careful would notice. And Daniel, more than anyone, understood that the forest was not simply quiet, it was watching. On August 14th, 2025, rain poured hard across the Highland Road, drumming against the roof of the small petrol station where Fiona McLeod worked late into the evening. She was used to long shifts in the isolated outpost, a place where passing vehicles were few and most nights were quiet. Fiona, born and raised in the nearby village, had always carried a steady calm, and her job gave her solitude to read, write notes, or simply watch the storm from the glass window of the shop. That night, though, the weather carried a restless weight. The fog hung thick over the valley, pressing against the forecourt lights and bending shadows across the gravel. The peace was broken when 3 travelers stumbled toward the station. Their arrival was sudden, marked by the sound of boots sliding through mud and frantic movements under the rain. Their clothes were torn, their faces pale, and they shook as if chased. Each of them had been walking a trail earlier in the evening, trying to cut across the forest to save time. The storm had slowed their progress, and as night fell, they became disoriented in the heavy mist. That was when they saw it, something vast, dark, and moving far faster than anything human. The sight had frozen them for only a breath, but the weight of its size forced their instincts to run without pause until the lights of the station came into view. Inside, the storm's noise drowned out most sounds, but Fiona noticed details others might have missed. When she looked out onto the wet ground near the pumps, her eyes caught imprints pressed deep into the gravel. They were huge, far beyond any ordinary boot, each one clear despite the rain, suggesting a weight that had crossed the forecourt only moments before. The muddy trail of the strangers aligned with these impressions, and it seemed impossible that the timing was anything but intentional. Nearby, she spotted metal fuel cans lying on their sides, not toppled by the wind, but pushed hard against the concrete. The storage shed at the far corner of the property showed signs of force. Long, uneven scrapes cut into the boards, against it. These were not random marks. They reached high above the ground, too high for any tool or passerby to leave in such a way. The storm covered the land in a blur of rain and fog, but then came a sound that cut through everything. From somewhere beyond the pumps, deep within the wall of trees, rolled a growl so low and resonant, it rattled the air around the shop. The travelers crouched behind the counter, clutching each other, their breaths sharp and uneven. Fiona stood still, her heartbeat matching the rhythm of the storm outside. Every sign pointed to something massive and deliberate lurking in the dark, and the night that had begun as routine had turned into a moment of dread. The growl faded into the storm, but the silence it left behind was even heavier than the sound. Fiona stood frozen near the counter while the travelers crouched low, too afraid to move. Rain lashed against the windows and rattled the roof, yet all she could hear was her own pulse hammering. The deep tracks in the gravel and the clawed marks on the shed no longer felt like distant signs. Whatever had made them was now close, watching. The storm had hidden its shape, but its presence pressed down on the station like a weight that could not be lifted. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every gust of wind seemed sharper, every flicker of the overhead light a reminder that the fragile walls and glass were the only barriers between them and something immense. The travelers, shivering in their damp clothes, tried to steady themselves, but their eyes never left the dark edges of the forecourt. Fiona, steady by nature, felt her calm tested in a way she had never known. The storm raged, and then, without warning, the sound returned. This time it was not a growl, but a thud, heavy and deliberate somewhere beyond the pumps. The ground seemed to tremble with each step as if something vast was circling, tracing paths in the storm's cover. The pattern was not random. It mirrored the prints she had seen earlier, looping with intent, as though measuring or observing. Then came the sound of wood cracking near the shed, branches snapping one after another in a slow rhythm that carried through the rain. The group stayed hidden, and Fiona forced herself not to look outside again. Her instincts told her that curiosity would only draw attention. The moment stretched until the noises faded once more, replaced by the hollow echo of the storm. When at last dawn crept in, pale light spilling over the wet ground, the forecourt was empty. The prints were fresh, scattered in wide arcs, some pressed into the mud so deeply they pooled with rainwater. The storage shed stood altered, marks carved higher than before, as if whatever had passed during the night had returned to leave a new warning. Authorities later arrived after Fiona reported what had happened. They examined the shed, the cans, and the prints, but gave little weight to the details. They suggested the storm and wandering animals were enough to explain the scene, though none of them could answer why the tracks were so large or why they moved in deliberate patterns. The travelers left the area quickly, unwilling to spend another night anywhere near the station. Fiona continued her shifts, but each evening carried the memory of that night. The growl still echoed in her mind, low and endless, as if it lingered in the woods, waiting. The prints eventually washed away, and the shed was repaired. But the stillness that followed every storm seemed unnatural. Locals began avoiding that road, whispering of something vast and silent that roamed the highlands. Fiona never spoke much of it, but she knew with certainty that it had not been her imagination. Something patient had revealed itself that night, and its presence had changed the quiet station forever. On February 11th, 2022, the Siberian wilderness was shrouded in a heavy blanket of snow, its frozen trees swaying in the sharp wind. Far from any village or road, survivalist Viktor Sokolov had set up camp in the taiga, a place where silence ruled, and only the hardiest souls dared to stay alone. He had lived most of his life close to nature, learning to build fires with little more than flint, to track animals across ice, and to survive with only the tools he carried. For him, solitude was not a punishment, but a challenge that tested his strength and spirit. This trip was meant to be 1 week of quiet endurance, a chance to live off the land and push himself against the cold expanse of Siberia. When the search team later traced his steps, they found a site that did not match the calm order expected of an experienced man. The fire pit sat cold and untouched, surrounded by logs half buried in snow. Supplies still rested in their containers, food untouched, tools left exactly as they had been packed. The tent, however, was torn open from the outside, its fabric slashed into long strips that flapped in the wind. Inside, the canvas walls bore markings that unsettled even the most hardened searchers. Jagged scratches ran in loops and arcs, some overlapping into crude shapes that looked deliberate, not random. Beside the wreckage, on a smooth stone, lay his journal. Its pages, soaked from melting snow, revealed hurried writing unlike anything from his earlier notes. Instead of calm descriptions of weather and hunting, circles were crossing jagged lines, spirals drawn over and over, and erratic strokes that seemed to burst from fear. Some pages showed lines spreading outward like rays, repeated again and again, as though the act itself had become an obsession. The entries carried no words, only these unsettling symbols, filling sheet after sheet. The most disturbing details lay beyond the camp. Prints pressed deep into the snow surrounded the site, each one longer than half a meter, with spacing too wide for a human stride. They circled the tent, moving in sharp angles, crossing one another in ways that looked intentional. The snow itself bore unnatural arcs, long grooves etched into the surface as if something massive had dragged itself around, tracing paths that were neither straight nor random. The tracks suggested a presence that had moved carefully, not with the aimless wander of a wild animal. The arrangement of patterns hinted at something watching, circling, and waiting. Victor himself was nowhere to be found. No signs of struggle remained beyond the torn fabric and disturbed snow. No blood, no trail of flight, nothing but the marks and his abandoned belongings. As the wind howled through the trees, the searchers stood uneasy. They could not explain the scratches, the strange drawings, or the heavy tracks pressed into frozen earth. The camp felt abandoned, but not empty. It felt as though the watcher that had circled the fire still lingered in the forest, hidden, silent, and patient, unwilling to let its presence fade. Snow fell heavier as the team remained near the abandoned site, and the quiet pressed against them like a weight. The strange loops carved in the ice seemed to shimmer under the pale light, almost alive in their stillness. Though the group had searched every tree line, no figure had been seen, no sound carried through the frozen branches, yet the camp felt watched. The prints circling the area gave the impression of something that had chosen not to hide, but to make its presence known. Each step sank deep into the ground, as if whatever had left them carried an impossible weight. Authorities marked the place, collected the journal, and photographed the disturbed earth. The torn fabric of the shelter was taken, yet the feeling of unease did not leave. Those who worked at the site whispered later that they felt their backs prickle, as if eyes were fixed upon them, even when nothing moved in the dark timber. Some refused to stay after nightfall, leaving others to guard the area with lanterns that flickered in the cold wind. Days passed, but no sign of Victor returned. The snow erased the original trails, yet the deeper tracks refused to vanish, pressed so firmly that even fresh snowfall could not mask their outlines. They remained like scars upon the earth. Villagers from nearby towns spoke quietly of the marks, saying any known creature did not make them. They avoided the place, believing something had claimed it. Hunters who ventured near reported hearing low vibrations in the distance, not the howl of wolves or the crack of branches, but a rolling sound that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The journal, once studied, raised even more questions. Experts were unable to match the symbols to any known language or art style. The repeated shapes were drawn under strain, the lines frantic yet intentional. Some suggested that the survivalist had fallen into madness during his isolation, but those who knew him dismissed the idea, reminding others of his discipline and strength. Instead, the entries were seen as a record of something he had witnessed, something he could not describe with words. In the weeks after, more reports emerged from the region. Travelers claimed to see strange arrangements in the trees, logs placed upright in lines, branches bent into arcs that could not have happened naturally. Campsites were found with fires untouched, but belongings shifted into neat rows. The same style of patterns appeared again, spreading beyond the original clearing. Each discovery deepened the fear that the presence was not bound to a single place, but moved freely through the taiga, tracing its symbols where it pleased. Searches for Victor slowed, then ended, although no closure was achieved. The site remained avoided, left as it had been, the slashed tent poles still frozen in place. Locals spoke of him as if he had been taken, not lost, absorbed into the endless forest by the same watcher that left the deep arcs and looping marks. To this day, the snow still falls on the clearing, covering the remains of the camp. But those who wander too close swear they hear the crunch of footsteps that are not their own, pacing slowly in circles just beyond sight, waiting in the silence of the trees. On August 14th, 2025, the air was heavy with rain as Lucas Harper steered his motorcycle along a lonely road cutting through thick forest in Washington. Lucas was 32 years old, a mechanic by trade, who enjoyed long night rides to clear his thoughts. He had spent most of his adult life working with engines, tuning cars, and fixing broken parts in a small garage on the outskirts of town. Riding gave him peace, especially on nights when the world seemed quiet and the road stretched endlessly in front of him. That evening, the weather was grim. The rain fell in sheets, and fog drifted through the trees, making every turn on the road feel more dangerous than the last. Still, he pressed on, trusting his machine and his own experience. The road glistened under the dim glow of his headlamp, each drop of rain bouncing off his helmet visor. As he rode deeper into the woods, the sound of the engine was the only comfort against the silence that surrounded him. But suddenly the calm was shattered. From the edge of the trees, something enormous surged forward. It struck with a force that knocked him clean off the bike. His shoulder burned with sharp pain as he hit the soaked ground, and the crack of his helmet against a jagged stone sent sparks through his vision. The weight of the thing pressed him into the mud. For a brief moment, he felt trapped beneath its strength, unable to move. The pressure crushed the air from his lungs while claws scraped across his jacket and tore into his arm. The sensation was brutal, deliberate, and nothing like the wild swipes of an ordinary animal. It felt as though something intelligent had aimed its strike. Adrenaline surged, and Lucas rolled violently, breaking free just as the shape retreated into the blackness of the forest. Rain poured harder, soaking the soil where deep impressions had been left. He staggered to his knees, clutching his side, ribs aching with every breath. He forced his body up, swaying unsteadily as his eyes caught sight of the prints. Each one was half a meter in length, embedded deep into the earth, far larger than any human foot. Snapped branches and torn undergrowth marked the path where the figure had moved back into the shadows. His motorbike lay on its side, the wheels still spinning weakly. Mud splashed up over the chrome. Lucas stumbled toward the road, blood dripping from his scratched arm, his cracked visor giving a distorted view of the storm. Fear and shock pulsed through him as he dragged his body back to the safety of the pavement. The sound of the rain drowned out everything, yet he could not shake the sense that eyes were still on him from the trees. When the authorities later arrived, they looked over the scene, noting the damaged gear and broken branches. They spoke of a bear, saying the wounds and tracks could fit that story. But Lucas knew better. The movement had been too quick, the strike too exact, the shape too tall. Nothing he had ever heard of in those woods could leave signs so massive or attack with such force. Lucas stood on the wet asphalt, trembling as the storm hammered down, his breath ragged from pain and shock. The authorities had already taken their notes, but once their vehicles disappeared down the slick road, he was left alone with the memory of what had struck him. His bike was hauled away for repair, yet the gouges on his jacket and the swelling in his ribs spoke louder than any report. The night pressed in, heavy and unnerving, and every sound of wind in the treetops carried a weight that would not leave him. He spent the following day at home, resting, but sleep refused to come. Every time he closed his eyes, the image returned of that shadow bursting from the trees, the impact crushing him into the earth. His arm throbbed where the claws had torn through his skin, and the bruises around his ribs deepened, making every movement a reminder of the moment he had been pinned. Friends visited to check on him, but he could not explain what he felt, only that it had been far larger and stronger than anything he had ever imagined could roam the forest. News of the attack spread quickly through the small town. People whispered about the incident at gas stations and diners, comparing it to sightings they had heard years ago. Some dismissed it as a bear. Others said it sounded like something far more mysterious. The officers held firm to their explanation, citing tracks and wounds as proof of wildlife. Yet those who had known the woods all their lives shook their heads in doubt. No bear left prints that long. No bear struck with such precision. For Lucas, the aftermath grew worse each night. When the wind blew across his house, it seemed to carry faint echoes of that roar that had rattled his chest in the storm. He would wake drenched in sweat, convinced that the shape stood again in the corner of his vision, watching from the shadows just as it had from the trees. He began keeping his curtains closed, checking his locks twice before trying to rest. The damaged clothing remained untouched on a chair, the slashes across the fabric too deliberate to ignore. He often stared at them, tracing the ragged edges with shaking fingers, wondering why it had let him live when it could have ended everything in an instant. The thought gnawed at him that it had not been a wild attack at all, but a test, a way of showing power while holding back. The road where it happened grew quieter in the days that followed. Riders avoided it, uneasy with the stories that spread after dark. Hikers spoke of uneasy silences in the woods and the sense of being followed. The storm had washed away some signs, but not the fear. Lucas carried the scars forward, not just on his skin, but deep inside, an unshakable reminder that something vast and intelligent had struck him down and then vanished. He knew the officials would continue to deny it, yet the memory lived on in every bruise. every restless night and in the knowledge that the forest still held a secret that was not finished with him. On December 19th, 2022, the storm over Aspen buried the peaks in ice and snow as the ski patrol prepared to close the mountain for the night. Aaron Caldwell, a veteran of the patrol, was used to danger in the wilderness, from sudden avalanches to injured skiers stranded in whiteouts. She had dedicated years to this work, often leading groups back to safety through harsh weather when others might falter. Her reputation for calm under pressure made her the natural leader that night, guiding a handful of visitors down toward the lodge. The group trudged slowly through the drifts, the air so thick with snow that even the bright lights of the chairlifts looked like fading stars behind curtains of white. Each breath burned in the cold, and the wind screamed through cables above, shaking the chairs as they swayed like ghostly shapes in the gale. Aaron carried a flare at her side, one of the few lifelines against the swallowing dark. The tourists, tired and frightened, followed in her tracks, their gear heavy, their eyes wide in the storm. It was then, in the blur of snow and shadow, that something vast moved between the trees. The figure appeared and vanished almost in the same instant, tall and broad, slipping through the storm with impossible speed. For a moment, time slowed. Aaron raised her arm and signaled for the others to stop. Flares were struck, their burning light flickering across the drifts, but nothing emerged. The storm swallowed the glow, and the silence stretched until the wind roared again. The tracks were found soon after, pressed deep into the packed snow near the base of the lift. Each step was enormous, far wider and longer than any human stride. What unsettled them most was not their size, but their placement. They circled, looping around the machinery in a way that suggested purpose. The pattern resembled a watchful orbit, as though something had been studying the area, staying just beyond sight. The unease grew when they noticed their belongings. Skis leaned against the racks in unnatural angles, crisscrossed like broken crosses. Several backpacks were opened neatly, not torn, but unzipped as if curious hands had searched inside. Food packets lay scattered in the snow, emptied yet untouched by animals. Nothing was destroyed, only rearranged, placed with care in a way that felt deliberate and mocking. As they gathered at the base, the wind carried an unnatural sound. It was not the storm, nor the creak of the lift, but a low, guttural noise that rose and fell in tones no one could place. It echoed through the storm, distant yet close enough to freeze the group in place. Eyes searched the storm for movement, but the white curtain revealed nothing. By the time they reached the lodge, the fear was etched into their faces. Whispers spread quickly among those inside, about a massive shadow that had come close without being seen. In the safety of the warm lodge, none could shake the truth. They had been watched, stalked by something hidden within the storm. By morning, the snowstorm had calmed, yet the memory of the night lingered heavily over those who had walked through it. Inside the lodge, silence filled the standard room as the patrol tried to rest. Some sipped hot drinks, but the warmth did little to ease the fear etched into their eyes. The storm outside had erased every trace of the giant tracks that had circled the lift, but the images remained sharp in their minds. What unsettled them most was not just what they had seen, but the knowledge that the figure had moved so close without ever being caught in the flares. Erin sat apart, replaying every step through the blizzard. She recalled the shadow gliding between trees, the perfect loop of impressions in the snow, and the way the wind had carried unnatural sounds across the slope. For years, she had handled injuries, rescues, and sudden avalanches, but never had she felt the weight of being hunted. The thought that something larger than any bear, more cunning than any wolf, had observed them shook even her steady resolve. At first light, a team ventured outside to survey the area. The sky was pale blue, the peaks glittering under fresh snow, yet the air held a stillness that felt wrong. They combed the base of the lift, finding the racks empty, but still arranged at odd angles, as though mocking order. The backpacks were returned by staff, but not before everyone noticed the precision with which they had been opened. Nothing had been stolen. Instead, the contents had been carefully moved, examined, and laid out before being closed again. This care struck them more deeply than destruction would have. As the group inspected further, they found branches stacked nearby in strange arrangement. Some leaned in triangular shape, while others bent unnaturally, as if forced into place. The patterns carried no clear meaning, yet suggested intention, as though a message had been left in a language none of them could read. These signs, combined with the deep tracks from the night before, left no doubt that the encounter had been purposeful. By midday, whispers spread beyond the patrol. Visitors recalled hearing guttural calls over the roar of the storm, while others described shadows pacing along the edges of the lodge's lights. A few laughed it off, blaming fear and exhaustion, yet most grew quiet when asked about what they had heard. Even without proof, the unease was shared by all who had stayed through the storm. Officials later classified the incident as weather-related, noting the dangers of hypothermia, exhaustion, and poor visibility. Yet those who had stood in the storm knew better. They remembered the shadow's speed, the deliberate circles in the snow, and the strange care given to their belongings. These were not the signs of accident or chance. Long after, the mountain returned to calm, but for those who were there, the storm had revealed something hidden. It had moved among them unseen, clever, and immense, leaving only patterns in snow and fear that would not fade.